Hello, this is Grant Hamby and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a special guest with me, Matt Ledbetter, who's a philosophy student at the University of South Carolina. We met a few months back at a cookout and we got to talking about music and decided, it might be a good idea to actually talk about this on my channel. So here we are at the C.S. Lewis Center on the University of South Carolina campus. So I'd like to welcome Matt, and could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'll give you my musical background since that's what we're talking about. I played trombone and I sang throughout school, starting in elementary school all the way through high school. Did one semester of a trombone performance degree, and then decided I was gonna take myself elsewhere. Don't know if I had the disposition to sit in a room and work by myself all day. I still love music mostly. I've been listening to a lot of jazz lately because all my buddies still doing music happen to be jazz musicians, but haven't practiced myself in a while.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because when I was a composition student at North Carolina School for the Arts, I found that all my buddies ended up being jazz musicians for some reason or another. They were the cool ones. They had the best parties, actually.
Yeah, they always do.
Jazz musicians typically, they have the best parties, so we just hung out with them.
Yeah, there's a joke about jazz musicians. There's a trombonist, Dave Taylor. He's an incredible orchestral and jazz guy, and he said he picked jazz over orchestra because he was hanging out with some of his buddies. He said, what do you want to do after the concert? You want to go get a drink, or you want to sit around and eat quiche?
That's good. So we decided that we would talk a little bit about issues pertaining to music and philosophy. And one of the issues that we were actually kind of talking about was music and, strangely enough, music and history, I think. That is, one of the questions is that in music aesthetics, is it true that music progresses? There's this idea that it's very embedded in 18th and 19th century philosophical discourse, is that history is directional, it's moving in a direction forward, and that is an idea that's been very much debunked in the later 20th century, but it's still a very strong idea, and music is certainly affected by that, the idea that music progresses forward and that as history moves forward, music becomes more and more complex, it becomes more and more rich, and it becomes somehow or another better. I think the idea leading to a kind of utopian vision of music, or music as a kind of utopia. What do you think about that?
I don't know so I think it's almost perspective based, because I definitely know some people who view within different traditions. You have the Romantics, they really want to see the fulfillment of the Romantic project, or the fulfillment of some more contemporary project. It seems maybe we can say it progresses in that way. People take this one form and they distort it or attempt to make it maximally good in their own image. But as a whole, it doesn't seem to me that we had bad music at one point, or music that wasn't fully formed, and now we're reaching something that is more complete.
Right. I think there are two sources for it. One is certainly the Enlightenment idea of history is moving forward and things constantly getting better. But I think, at least for many musical aestheticians in the 19th century, many of whom were German, they were being very influenced by Hegel, and Hegel had this idea that history is this unfolding of what he called the world spirit or world consciousness, and art eventually would realize itself in I think it's the ideal, is the way he put it. And so many German musicians, including Arnold Schoenberg, was very taken with this idea as well. For him, the 12-tone system was the fulfillment, was the apex of this historical process. So yeah, that's an idea that's definitely fallen on hard times because it's so culturally dependent, right? I mean, it's very much dependent on a certain view of what constitutes tonality, what constitutes musical form, musical structure, that is culturally determined. That is really the culture of Central Europe in the 18th and 19th century. So I don't think that idea has a lot of currency in today's world, or does it? Do you think it does? I mean, I do hear some musicians who
some people talk about that way. I'd be interested to talk to somebody who does posttonal music specifically and see if they view themselves as a progression? Because it seems more, when I talk to those types of people who are really into the contemporary stuff, they see themselves as a refounding or a disjunct from previous traditions, rather than
right. Rather than as a continuation of a sort of a certain tradition, this is a break with the tradition, and that's an interesting thing. When you talk to people in the academy, theorists and practitioners of posttonal music, the way it's presented is, tonality happened, tonality is done. Now we've progressed to the posttonal world. I'm not sure that's exactly accurate. Certainly, if you go to the founder of posttonality, which I would consider to be Arnold Schoenberg. Schoenberg certainly didn't consider that. He considered himself to be embedded in a given tradition, that is the tradition of Austro-Germanic music. That's very clear from everything that he wrote. He saw himself as a continuation of that, not as a break from it. But when you do look at discourse today in the posttonal world, well, it seems to me there's two stands. Some posttonal theorists seem to regard posttonality as a continuation, whereas others seem to consider it to be an entirely new thing that's a break from the past.
I think a lot of it comes back to perspective. Because we take the ideas of the academy that's outside looking in, right? And they can see the story of music. So you can say the story of music has progressed and now we're doing this, we used to do that. But the boots on the ground, the people actually writing and doing the music, I'm not sure if they think in that context. I mean, we can talk about maybe that's just because they've got a smaller bubble or a smaller focus, whereas the academy is sitting there and they have the benefit to have that distance, that disinterested almost perspective, where they can just see what's going on and then create a narrative about it or examine the narrative of it. But they themselves aren't doing it. They're not the one. They're just
right. They're not the ones who are performing, necessarily performing and composing. We're talking about historians and theorists primarily, not necessarily composers or people who are performing.
Exactly.
Who have they know music history, they know music theory, but they don't try to put together some kind of broader philosophical framework for how to understand the genesis, development, and whether or not there is a goal direction in music or not. That makes perfectly good sense. That's
maybe it's a difference between the act of doing it, like doing the music, and hearing the music. Maybe there's a little bit of some active passive thing that informs that possible difference in perspective.
Or a kind of difference between praxis and theory. Exactly. I think that's fair enough to say. I mean, because when you start to look at the situation in classical music today, contemporary classical music, it's no longer a merely European phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon, and classical music is no longer located in Central, Eastern, or even the whole of Europe. It's something that's spread everywhere. You hear the influence and impact of Western music from Korean pop music to Indian film music. It's pervasive everywhere, and so it's become a kind of global phenomenon. But at the same time, it has merged with local traditions to become something other. So you can't really. I don't think it's possible at this stage of the game to talk about classical music as a kind of hermetically sealed phenomenon. It's something that expands well beyond its horizons. Now, I guess you could get into some colonialist, post-colonialist discourse concerning that as well. But I think it's a dialectical process. I mean, Western musicians have been as influenced by the musics of other world as the musics of other world have been influenced by Western classical music. So it's reciprocal. At least I want to think it's reciprocal.
See, I wonder. You see so many forms now being adapted into the symphony, the symphonic sphere. So you have a lot. You have the real pentatonic, Asiatic type things that get incorporated, and even with instrumentation, people play around with that a whole lot now. And I wonder if it's fair to say that that's a blurring of the lines and a mixing rather than the subsumption of those into the Western sphere. You mentioned the colonialist perspective, and I imagine if you take a similar train of thought to that, you could get to this idea where maybe there's not so much a diversification or a breaking down of genre, but more the just assimilation of these other forms from the non-Western tradition into the Western tradition. They've been Westernized in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to a certain degree, and I think it really especially begins with Debussy, and it's a process that continues on. I think it's also you see it in Stravinsky as well, where he's taking music from really across Russia but in other places as well, and incorporated it in his music. That's an interesting contrast between those modernists, the Russian and the French modernists, and the German modernists in the early 20th century, because the German modernists, especially Schoenberg, I keep seeing it coming back to for some reason or another.
If I wanted to come back.
Well, he's such a major character. You can't talk about 20th century music without talking about Schoenberg. You have to address him in one way or another because he is the single most dominant figure in the early 20th century, because neither Stravinsky nor Debussy were theorists.
Yeah.
And they didn't try to be theorists. Schoenberg was actually a theorist. He wrote one of the classic textbooks on tonal harmony. He wrote excellent textbooks on musical composition. He wrote a brilliant textbook on counterpoint. Just absolutely grueling to go through, but you learn counterpoint through it. I mean, he really knew the theory behind the practice inside and out.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't function just as a composer in this context, he also functions as a theorist, and that's kind of an unusual thing. I mean, he was a major composer and a major theorist at the same time.
And you can almost tell that just from listening to his music, because it's got that real, almost mathematical or formulaic quality that you can figure out. You can sit down and figure out.
Which is interesting because he would totally disagree with that. He repeatedly in his writings says that the function of music is expression.
Yeah.
And that is what he is aiming for, is expression.
I don't know if those are mutually exclusive. I actually talked to my older brother about this exact thing one time, because he's really into electronic music. And he had this idea about machines expressing things or math expressing things. There was almost this conception that if things get too formalized, or if there's a definable strict pattern, that you're missing some of the expression. But I think you can do both of them. And I think you get a lot of that, especially when you get into the 12-tone music, where it is so mathematical, but you can still frame it within those bounds as something great. You can even see that to a lesser extent with somebody like Shostakovich, who had very, very strict boundaries to what he was allowed to do by the state.
Right.
And he just plays with it in the framework that he has to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, Shostakovich, I think, would have definitely written more serial music had he been allowed to, but that was something that was very much frowned down upon, especially during the Stalinist era. And that's an interesting point that you raise, because we've talked about mathematics and music. I mean, the two are deeply linked with one another. I mean, going all the way back to the Pythagoreans and Plato, who believed that musical structures were primarily mathematical in nature. So it's a deeply rooted concept. But what I find interesting is that you do have composers, even someone like Arvo Pärt, who uses arithmetical structures in his music, although it sounds very consonant, very tonal, but it's not. It's actually built around mathematical structures. So, and it loses nothing by being so. But the other thing that you also kind of raised there is the case of Shostakovich. I mean, for myself, I consider Shostakovich one of the major composers of the 20th century. Incredibly original, produced some absolutely magnificent music. Yet the Western avant-garde from the 30s to the 60s tended to look down on Shostakovich as being kind of a fifth-rate Mahler. I would disagree with that. I think within the constraints of what he was forced to do politically, he still produced great music. And that kind of leads to the question, though, and again, this is a question going back to Plato. Plato comes up a lot in these discussions. What role does music play in the political sphere? That's a real touchy issue too, given especially should we cancel Beethoven? Why should they cancel Beethoven? Cancel culture, the political side of music, what are the politics of music? Should music be political? Is music political? That's something that I've actually been thinking about, quite a bit lately. The political aspects of music. Does music have a role to play in politics, do you think?
And I think it definitely can play a role in national anthems. Anything inspiring patriotism or pride. There's definitely a political element. My interest is how if we were to write a piece of music for a candidate or for even let's get even vaguer, a political idea. How would we construct that so it would further that goal or be manipulative or persuasive for that end? It definitely can be. It seems you can tie things together, or you can write songs specifically for that, but I'm not sure why.
You're not sure why one would want to write music?
Not why one would want to, but why the music is able to evoke that or further the goal. What is it about that communication, or what is the argument that it's presenting that people get unconsciously?
Well, I think that the reason why music is such a powerful tool for the expression of political ideas is because music strikes us at an emotional level, not necessarily a discursive level. We use language to discourse. Now, language can be used in such a way to simply draw emotions out, but there is something about language that there's something about the word that always separates us from the object.
Yeah.
Right? There's the word, but the word mediates the object. Whereas I think music affects us emotionally more directly and more immediately because, and a lot of the neuroscience backs this up, because it elicits a physiological response from us very directly. And when you start to look at the way the Soviets use music, but also the way the Nazis in World War II used music, especially the music of Bruckner, for example, this music was used to whip people up into a frenzy, and especially at rallies, and it worked. And anyone who's been to, for example, I don't want to confine this to simply like a rock concert or a heavy metal concert, but if you've been to those, you see how people can get really worked up. And it doesn't, again, like I said, it doesn't have to be that. You remember that Franz Liszt would get people fainting and women throwing their underwear on stage just because he was so gorgeous to look at and was just, really
good,
an amazing musician, right? And he really knew how to work the crowd. Yeah, music has a deep capacity for eliciting some of those primal emotions out of us, and I think that's why politically it's so tempting and so easy to use.
I've been thinking about this connection a little bit lately. So the Greeks, when they talk about perceptions, talk about impressions, and that's almost how it is. So maybe you don't get the thought so much that it would be required if you're speaking or trying to reason out how to convince someone or manipulate somebody or further a goal. It's kind of like you just look at it, you just hear it, and you know.
Yeah.
It's like you get the feeling and you know what it's saying.
Yeah, I think that's partially true. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot and trying to formulate arguments against is the notion of listening to music as an intellectual exercise, which there is a certain pleasure that one derives from that. And our entire academic structures musically are geared towards listening with the intent to mentally analyze.
Yeah.
In which case you kind of have to bypass some of the emotional circuitry to get to that point. Or you have to become so good at it that you can do both at the same time. And that's the ideal. I think that music, it's not so much an impression that it leaves as a response that it elicits.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, music, we respond to it. I was actually thinking about ASMR music recently a lot. Yeah, and then that's music that in some way serves to function. It's there, but it's not present.
Yeah. What I was trying to get at with the impression example.
Okay.
I think is the exact same thing you're talking about. Because it's just there. Like there's something that's missing if you like read a book and we're looking at the arguments and doing the analysis. Even if you're listening to the music and analyzing it, there's something about where it's just you hear it and that's it. Like you've got it. You know, it's like, and it elicits a response and it's almost condensed into one action. Right.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that does make sense. But my big issue, I mean, kind of getting back to music and politics, is how does one compose music that is political and intentionally so without becoming a tool?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, no one wants to be a tool of anyone's political agenda. And if you are a composer or a musician or a performer, and you make yourself a tool, at some level, you can end up looking very silly especially if you're batting for the wrong cause. You really look silly afterwards. I can't help but think of Theodor Adorno, a famous Marxist philosopher, who was also a composer, but he absolutely hated jazz. I mean, he just went on this diatribe against jazz and talking about how degenerate it was. I mean, he honestly sounded so right-wing when he was writing about this, even though he was a leftist. He sounded right-wing, which I find just hysterical because, you can tell where he had his investment. He honestly thought that there was progress in history and that 12-tone or serial music was the future and that was it. And anything other than that is not the future. And he was being very dogmatic about it in a way that certainly Schoenberg was not. And I don't even think Weber or certainly not Weber would have. None of the Viennese masters would have been the least bit impressed with his arguments. I think. Of course, he was writing after all. I think. Well, Schoenberg must have been alive at that point, but the others were dead.
I always have this issue when we talk about whether somebody should do the thing. Should they be the tool for the cause, or should they do it entirely for that? Because I can imagine that one could be that person and have that intent and still produce something that is great. And I guess it depends on whether or not we're looking at the purity of the person's intentions towards making good art, as opposed to looking at the piece itself. And some of that I think kind of goes back to the same problem we have now with like cancel culture, where if somebody did something bad, we have to destroy everything they were ever associated with, right? Instead of isolating it, and you get very different answers to the question when you isolate things.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the extent to which we should do that for this analysis.
No, I agree with that. If you are very committed to a particular cause and you feel that your music can help advance that cause, then I think that you do have a kind of, if you want to put it this way, dharma.
Yeah.
Or you have a duty. You have a dharmic duty to actually write that kind of music. And composers, I just find that as a general rule, the results of such compositions in the past have been kind of mixed. From Beethoven's Wellington's Victory, not one of his greater works, to an 1812 overture by Tchaikovsky, and not one of his greatest works, and then Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. This is a great symphony, but how much of it is being ironic? That's certainly a good question. Now, when you go to his symphony Baba Yaga, on the other hand, right, there's definitely a political intent behind that, or a moral intent behind it anyway, and I think that it's highly successful for that reason.
Yeah. And
that's one of the examples where you can have music that is somewhat politically or morally motivated, that is successful in what it sets out to do.
It seems to me like maybe the issue, or the limiting factor there, is how much the expression is limited by its goal, as opposed to when it works, how much it is attuned to it, or it doesn't feel like the goal or the cause the person is trying to further is restrictive on the art.
Right. Yeah. To what degree is the goal that you're trying to forward, how much is it constraining your creative efforts?
Yeah.
Is it constraining your creative efforts, or is it advancing your creative efforts?
I
think it's a good question.
I mean, because then we have this problem where you just haven't, you didn't do the best thing. Like, it could have been better. You doesn't seem like you put all your creativity or all your talent into it. There is a failing in some way. It's like, oh, it could have been so great if you had just made this thing, and maybe would have still been able to further that goal, but you were so dedicated to the goal that you lost sight of the making of the art itself. Right.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I love Frank Zappa. Right? Absolutely
love the bassoon.
Yes, love Frank Zappa, and a lot of his music is satire. Yeah. This is again a very personal opinion, but honestly, I think his satire, the lyric satire he wrote, is some of the best lyric satire since the classical age. It's some of the best satire since Catullus' satires, to the degree to which he wrote, which actually he did write satire, he wrote poetry, but he also wrote satire as well. It's very strange because satire can be political without being political. Yeah. And that's what I find in Zappa's music. It's political without being overtly political.
Yeah, it's just you're just poking fun at something. You're not pushing something.
Right.
Instead.
I mean, you think of a song like Bobby Brown, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that song is brilliant, but at the same time, it's also it's a very disturbing song. When I generally bring that song up in the United States, hardly anyone knows that song.
Okay.
When I bring it up in Europe, almost everyone I've ever talked to is somewhat familiar with it because they'll play it on the radios there.
Oh.
You don't really hear it on the radio here very often because it's so questionable. The lyrics are so questionable. But I think that song is a highly charged political, well, not political, let's say social satire.
Yeah.
And so it makes us uncomfortable. I think if art has a social or political or even moral goal and it makes us uncomfortable, then I think it's achieving the aim that it sets out to do.
It seems like it depends on whether or not you would, if you agree with the goal of it, right? Or B, just whether or not it's convincing, because you can listen to things where you can tell there's a point, and it's unconvincing, and that's why it's uncomfortable. And then you have instances where it's so convincing that you're comforted because you're put into that frame of mind, right? There's not so much of a viewing in like, oh, I'm not living up to, say it's trying to present a moral idea. It's like, oh, I'm not living up to that moral idea. I feel shame. I feel called out. Then you feel uncomfortable, maybe because it's succeeded, but it seems like it could also be the other way around. You could have something that's so convincing that, again, you have this condensing. It's like with the impressions where it's done such a good job, you're immediately comforted, you just feel like it's right. Right. You don't feel the discomfort.
Well, I think that's where music's, if you listen to a music with a moral or political intent behind it, and it usually would include text as well. Yeah. And you feel completely comforted by it, I think you're slipped out of simply the realm of political or social critique and into the realm of ideology. Yeah. You're basically comforted by the fact that the ideology that's being presented is somehow or another in agreement with your own ideology. Yeah. And so I will kind of stand by a little bit my assertion that it kind of need to make you feel uncomfortable, because otherwise then it becomes kind of just again another, oh yes, we agree. When the head starts nodding, you're not thinking anymore. You're just kind of going along with the flow. But I see what you're saying, and I think that's true. I think what you're saying is true to a degree. Yeah.
So it's a slightly different point than you're making. It's and then in the instance I described, it's like it grabbed you. You're really taken by it. If you would always talk about writing essays, you want to grab the audience. So you get them in, even if they're not reading your work like word by word. They're just kind of glossing it, but you form it so that they're just taken in by it. And that's very different than what you're describing, because you're describing somebody who's listening to it with that analytical awareness, right? Or with some type of
Oh
awareness.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. I think that's, I had a conversation with a friend recently, and it's something that comes up pretty frequently in most of my conversations with people, and it pertains mostly to pop music, although it certainly is not limited to pop music.
Okay.
Do you listen for the music, or do you listen for the lyrics? What are you listening to when you listen to a piece of music? This particular friend, there's two friends, we were talking. One person was basically saying, well, I listen to the lyrics first and primarily. And then this one friend was like, oh, I hardly pay attention to lyrics at all. I'm there for the music, all right? I mean, the lyrics are incidental to what I'm listening to. I think a large part of what it is that when I listen with the intent to analyze.
Yeah.
And
that's like the musician's curse.
It's the musician's. No, you're right. It absolutely is. I mean, your training has basically made you to where what you do when you listen to a piece of music is analyze, and it is kind of a curse, because you don't always want to analyze. Sometimes you just want to just completely submerge yourself into the music and
just enjoy it,
and enjoy it or be swept away by it. But see, if you're sitting there analyzing, you can't be swept away.
Have you ever had that issue where you'll go and listen to something and maybe it's not entirely perfect, but you can tell it's not wrong or it's not bad.
Yeah.
And it just irritates you that it doesn't fit in the way it's supposed to fit in.
Yeah. And that's what I characterize that as, is that's the curse of the text. Right? I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon, because since the invention of the printing press, and especially since the standardization of notation, we now have what we can consider to be a musical literature, right? There is a literature of music, and music exists in a kind of literary sense, in that it's written on paper. For the vast majority of human history, and in most cultures, and in many cultures today, music is oral and oral. It's not written. There's no literary element to it in that sense. And as theorists like Walter Ong, for example, noted, once you write something down, you change its character.
Oh yeah. Even like the ancient Egyptians even thought that about the power of words. They're the worst stories you don't write down, because that might make them true. And you see that. That's exactly what you're talking about with the text. Once you write the music down a certain way, you can just hold that up as the litmus thing. Do you measure up?
Right.
That's not written here. That's wrong.
Yeah.
And
that it predetermines what you can and can't do. And in a literate culture, I've actually, it's interesting that we've kind of come to this point, because now that I think about it, people talk about the death of classical music, the end of classical music. Could it be that part of the problem is that classical music, quote unquote, has become so determined by the act of writing the music, by the literary element of the music, that it somehow is no longer as engaging as it once was?
I think there's something like that in all the facets of classical music.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a lot of people complain it's stuffy, or you go there, you sit a certain way, you look a certain way, you don't really express or emote while it's going on. You just sit there and you take it. Everybody's dressed the same on stage, everybody looks the same, and maybe there's something like that with the music itself. Now, I've not heard that before. That's really interesting point, because I always hear it about just the outward appearance and the form,
the outward appearances,
not the music itself, whether or not that does. Now, I wonder, because there's this whole world now of contemporary improvisation, and some of it's out there, and people write pieces that are really modular. You just do it anyway, and I wonder if that fights that issue, or if we fall into a similar issue with that, or we fail to escape it.
I don't think it fights it to a certain degree. I mean, when I look at scores, recent scores, in which there's a great deal of, there's some notation, but there's a great deal of leeway in how that and how those directions and those gestures can be interpreted by the performers. I think it does. It breathes a little bit of life into music, because with the standardization of the score, the standardization of notation, you get so many similar sounding performances. And with the creation of recording technology and the fact that you can basically have it repeated over and over and over again, there's something about it that does. It loses a bit of its life, as it were. I mean, and that's something, again, going back to Plato again, it pops up. That's something he says very clearly, right? Is that writing kills the spirit, and actually you see that in Paul, who wrote that as well, right? I mean, writing is kind of death. It puts things into a very specific place, and it shuts it off.
Was it Socrates famously never wrote anything down because he didn't want to make a statement?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I think that might be some of the ills. I know there are people who are addressing that, right? And I think contemporary performers are more sensitive to it today than they ever have been.
That reminds me of a related issue. Because it's almost like the problem is it's getting boring, or it's no longer unique or novel or exciting, because you just know how it's going to be. When I was at Interlochen, one of our conductors talked about how when he was a kid, you could go around to all the different symphonies. You could close your eyes and know that you were listening to the Chicago Symphony. By the way, they started. You could know that you were in Boston. You could know that you were in San Francisco. And now more and more people sound the same. Even European orchestras today sound incredibly close to American orchestras.
Right.
And if you listen to a recording from the 50s, there's an entirely different style and way of playing.
Right. It's a local music culture, and it's something that with technology and with communication, there is a homogenization effect to it. Everything kind of becomes homogenized. I mean, German orchestras sounded different than French orchestras sounded different than Italian orchestras, and even within regions. I know, for example, listening to the Vienna Philharmonic, this is a very interesting experience, because some of the instruments they use are not used in any other orchestra in the world.
The Panay Valve French horns.
Right, and the trumpets as well, and also the oboes. They use a different oboe from the standard French oboes that are used mostly in other orchestras around the world, like the Lorrays, for example, or the Marico. Those oboes, I can't remember the name of them offhand, but they are actually a little bit more akin to early 19th century oboes, and they have a distinctly darker timbre. They sound differently. And you are kind of missing out on those differences as orchestras have become homogenized over the years. And to me, it's just simply another way of. I don't want this to go into a kind of diatribe or anything like that. But one of the critiques of modern Western capitalism has been homogenization. That was actually one of Marx's critiques himself. And the orchestra, the symphony orchestra, very much is a product of the industrial world. I mean, it's very, very difficult to conceive of the orchestra without conceiving of urban industrial societies, especially the large middle class of music lovers to attend those performances. And so while you had these local and regional differences and national differences in the 19th through the mid 20th century, as we now enter into a global phase of capital, music across the board becomes more homogenized. So orchestras become homogenous. So Berlin sounds like London, sounds like New York. And that's an interesting phenomenon in itself, because I think it does tend to kill the interest in classical music even more. Why go hear your local orchestra if they sound exactly like
the recording you can get
online of the New York Philharmonic, for example? Yeah.
So I'm really interested in that point you made about instrumentation, because I've noticed, particularly in the brass world, it's now really popular to, like, we have the alto trombone has come back into vogue and people
Yes.
use it a lot. People like to have, I know the Boston Symphony has a set of German horns they use for some things in the trombone section,
Mm-hmm.
and trumpet players in American orchestras more and more frequently play rotary trumpets. So you think that it would make a difference, but I don't notice that much of a difference. Even when they play around with the different instruments, they still sound very similar. It's
That's
like it's
interesting.
almost just
That's interesting.
like they do it like, oh, we're doing it the right way because we're using the right things, but we're gonna play not like the people who would normally play these instruments are gonna play. We're just gonna play them like we play our other ones, and we're gonna sound marginally different.
That's an interesting point. One of the things I'm pretty, my ears are pretty sensitive to is timbre, so
Yeah.
I can usually tell differences between the different instruments that are being used. For example, a B flat trumpet and a C trumpet sound different.
Oh yeah.
There's a very sharp difference between the two. I actually really always wanted to hear Brahms' Third Symphony played with F trumpets, which is what they're scored for.
Yeah.
I'm very curious what those F trumpets sound like, because when he scored for brass, Brahms scored very intentionally. I think it's in the horn trio where he specifies a natural horn.
Yeah.
Right. He wanted a specific sound quality coming from that, and usually I can tell that. But I see what you're saying. It's not so much the timbral sound that's the same. It is
the character doesn't change.
The character of how the music is delivered doesn't change.
I think a great example with that is the rotary trumpet. Much smaller lead pipe, should be much harder to play, really, really piercing and really, really stridently.
Yeah.
It should be warmer. But when I hear American orchestras use it, they play it like they're still playing the piston trumpet.
Right. That's a good point. I haven't really thought about it that much, but yeah, I mean you're making a great point, and I wouldn't mind investigating sometime.
I will say though, it's neat that you brought up Brahms, because I do notice instrumentation shifts there, especially because I play trombone. I'm always interested in that using the smaller horns and having the alto on top for Brahms is vastly better than if you try to play it on the larger equipment. It's instantly better.
Yeah, alto trombone is a beautiful instrument. I was surprised that it completely went out. I mean, it did. It literally just completely. Even if composers specifically called for it, you just couldn't find no one would play it, which is strange to me. I mean,
I think it's because it's not the easiest instrument to stay in tune in.
Well, that's probably why. That probably has something to do with it.
And a lot of tenor players just hate playing it.
Right.
So I don't want to do this. This is too much of a hassle.
Part of the move to get people back engaged with the classical tradition, broadly speaking, is to revive instruments like the basset horn, for example.
Yeah.
I know that there are composers who are working on writing compositions for the basset horn, which really does have a very unique sound. Usually people will replace it something more like with an alto or even bass clarinet. This is not the same sound at all. The basset horn has a distinct sound. Some of the older oboes have very distinct sounds. The serpentine is another example, right? I mean, I heard a performance of Berlioz's Symphony of Acoustique. In most performances, they'll use tuba right, for the dies irae, and this performance used an actual serpentine, which is what it's scored for. That's just an amazing sound. I mean, it's just, there's nothing else like it.
Very vocal.
Yes, it is. And there's another instrument that he also used, and I'm blanking on the name now for some reason or another. But
it starts with an O, doesn't it? His big stand up.
Yeah. Both those instruments have incredibly different sounds than any of the modern lower brasses. So one of the things I think is very hopeful in terms of keeping music alive and keeping it as a living form is trying to get at the timbres that the composers were thinking of when they were writing. Now, some people may argue that, well, isn't that just simply another kind of ossification, right?
Yeah.
Why not just go ahead and use whatever? If you don't have a serpentine, that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody carries a serpentine around. I don't know many people who do.
Not cheap.
They're not cheap.
expensive.
Yeah. So if you don't have one, use what you have. You could argue that it's another kind of ossification. However, I would also argue that, as in most things in life, diversity is very important. And so being able to have different performances in which you are more faithful to the timbres the composer was thinking of is a positive thing. I think where the ossification comes from, though, is not that. I think where the ossification comes from is in reading the score as a static rather than a dynamic object.
Yeah, it is interesting, though. Just to that point, it seems like the interest in using those instruments is kind of a new development. People wanting to be really, really faithful to the original layout. How would it have sounded to Bruckner or Berlioz? And what would they have wanted to sound like? What would they have heard? It seems like it's becoming increasingly, or it's becoming increasingly an interest in the community, right?
Yeah.
Instead of, and this may result a little bit in that real like fixing formulaic way. It's like, oh, this is the right way to do it, the way they thought it would, the way they imagined it. Rather than, we're going to do this our way. We're going to try to recreate what he wanted instead of, this is what we have, we're going to do it. And that may also inform or explain why people are starting to sound closer and closer together.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, you have the score in front of you. There's certainly a parameter of ways to interpret it.
Yeah.
There is no one right way. It is not a Platonic form that has to get instantiated in the world, right? I mean, it's not that. I think it's better to think of it in kind of Aristotelian terms, right?
Yeah.
The form is implicit in it, you kind of bring it out, but then there are going to be different perspectives on what that means, right? So that's what I'm gravitating to in my own practice and the way I think about it as well. Most people, possible exception of John Cage, most people, when they sit down to write, they do kind of have an idea in their head that they're trying to get across. But I think compositional intent or composer intent is a bit like authorial intent in general. It's not something you can prove, and especially in the case of music. Unlike literature, in which does again use words that signify concrete objects or concrete feelings. The note A at 440 hertz does not signify sunlight.
Yeah.
It doesn't signify a tree, right? It simply is a sound at a certain frequency and with a certain degree of overtones depending upon who or what is playing it or singing it. So you can't really make that kind of comparison. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, I've heard people try to make those types of interpretations where everything is representational and it all means some concrete thing, and it just falls apart. You could think that, but you can't establish it as a correct interpretation or the right way to do it. It's like reading a book. It's so much more interesting if you talk and have different opinions instead of being so rigidly stuck in, I think this, there's no way anyone else could think something else.
That is the bane of being human, I'm afraid. I mean, it's what we do, and we tend to do it all too frequently.
So we don't even notice it half the time.
We don't.
We get all stuck in our heads about the way we see things, and it detracts from the enjoyment of the things, and you have a massive reduction in the things you can enjoy and look at and take part in when you get stuck like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Why do you think music exists at all? I mean, I'm really curious because first things that we learn in philosophy classes is to ask the question, why should things exist at all? Why should anything exist? Why should we be here? Why should the universe be here, right? So let's just kind of condense that question down to a much more modest scale and ask the question, why should music exist? Because there are evolutionary scientists who argue that music is a cotton candy for the mind, I think is the phrase, and doesn't have any real evolutionary value, and there's no reason why it should exist. So why does music exist, do you think?
I think people naturally like to make things, or at least there are some people that are incredibly creative and need to produce. And that's one explanation. The other one is people are emotional, passionate things. We want people to understand or we want to be able to communicate what we feel and what we think in our expression, and it's not always easy to do that with words or with language. Like, how do you, if I tell you, oh, I'm feeling happy, like, you know what that means, but you don't get such an experiential thing in the same way. It's not, it's like being overwhelmed to the point where you would just shout out or scream. I think music has a similar element. Like, I'm going to write this down because I need to convey this, or I want to convey what I'm feeling in a way that makes you try to feel the same thing.
Oh, you don't even need to write it down. Just whistle a tune, right? I mean, some kind of gestural expression. That makes me think a little bit of something that Wittgenstein was kind of getting on to, and that's the physiognomy of music, right? That music is a very bodily experience. Philosophers have traditionally had a difficult time with the body. We don't really do a good job of accounting for the body. The body is like, we live in such a mental, intellectual space that the body is sort of like, we'll think about it when we get around to it, and you never quite seem to get around to it. As early as Plato, you had this sort of reification of the soul. Then with Descartes, you had separation of the mind and body, which took us a long time to get over that. Now we seem to have to come to terms with the fact that, at least in contemporary science, what we now understand is that our thought processes are intimately tied to our body. Our thought processes are intimately tied to our gut bacteria, which is, you can't get any more bodily than gut bacteria, right? They do like 70 billion bacteria in your gut that affect the vagus nerve, that affects your moods and how you feel. Yeah. And that has nothing to do whatsoever with the animal spirits.
The animal spirits.
Descartes. Sort of proposed. There's a direct connection between that and our mental state. When we produce music, it affects us sort of at the root core of our bodies. And I think what you're saying is, language is somewhat abstracted. It is more abstract than music, and it is somewhat abstracted from our body in a way that music is not. I guess that makes sense when you think about it, because you think, well, what is you enunciate a word.
Yeah, and think about just like creating language, like at the impetus, people are learning how to speak. What sound am I going to make to? What sound is the tree? How am I going to refer to that with a sound? Yeah, it could just be anything. And I think music is kind of the same way. Like if we, and I think this is a fair hypothesis, people sang or did something like that first, probably before making instruments. That just seems like what would have happened. It's just like, I want to tell you something. Mm-hmm. So here is this song, and I mean that even makes sense with the Greeks when you combine it with language. You have Homer who sings the whole Iliad. You take away the tone and the inflections and the pitch from it, and then it's just words, and it means something different.
That's true. I mean, many people forget that the Iliad and the Odyssey were sung. Yeah. They were never meant to be read. The writing occurred much later, and the way it was written down, basically what you have are just phonemes on a piece of paper that approximate a sound, but it does not give you the musicality. Well, to some degree it gives you the musicality, but not really. That's really one of the big differences between reading Homer on one hand and on the other hand reading Virgil. Yeah. And when you read Virgil is very musical in his language, but it's very clear that he's writing as language. He's writing as abstractions denoting various states of things or thoughts or feelings. Yeah. There is something about that is somewhat abstracted from the body, whereas a sound, an utterance, an oral gesture, is very rooted in the physicality of its origin. Yeah. In a way that words aren't. If I write down a new diagram, and if I write down, for example, in Chinese character, the word for man, jin, that's an abstraction. Yeah. Yeah. It has no connection. I mean, it has some vague connection with sound, but as far as we're concerned, it is simply a symbol symbolizing something that is an idealization or an ideal or concept or perhaps thing. With music,
its origin seems to be very much rooted in, you think of rhythm, dance, and then singing. When you sing, your body becomes an instrument.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager and I was an oboist, I tended to think, instruments are just so much better than the human voice. And once I started singing, I began to realize that no, the human voice is absolutely the most amazing instrument.
You can do so much.
I mean, there's things I can do with this that I can never do with a single instrument. No instrument can really capture the range of timbres, the range of emotions, the range of inflections that the human voice can. Yeah, why music? What is it that we have a need to express, though?
I mean, humans fall back on the Greeks again. Humans are social creatures. We need to communicate to get around in the world. We need to communicate with each other, to work within the tribe, to work within the society. I think music does a very good job of that. And even if nothing else, if you want to take a fully utilitarian view of it, it helps you get better at communicating. Like you mentioned rhythm. This is something that I think about a lot, particularly. I feel like people forget cadence in speech. Like you're speaking to somebody and they like rush through, or the way they structure, just the time it takes for them to say certain things.
Right.
It makes it harder to understand what they're saying.
That's true. Yeah.
And I think we have all these forms in arts generally, particularly in music and dance, where to express the thing a certain way, we play with the fundamental things we use to communicate, like tone, pitch, sound, and rhythm. And all these are essential to communicate. And I think it is intimately connected with how we use language generally. Because in the same way I can say something in a certain way, and you understand what I'm talking about, even though I said nothing about it. It's like that thing where the classic example is you're talking to a baby and you're like, I'm gonna punch you in the face, but you say it like really, really up. Yeah, it's like, because so there's more than just one element, and I think music has this combination of all of them. It allows you to express so many things so purely. It's almost like a primitive.
Yeah, and you're really talking about the gestural aspect of music in that respect. Yeah. No, I think that's true. I know, for example, and it's something because I actually struggle with. I mean, when it comes to speaking, I am not the most comfortable person in the world. I don't know why. I mean, just for some reason or another, I get tongue-tied very easily, and I tend to repeat myself and mumble and everything. But I think a large part of it is the fact that part of it's that we don't teach elocution.
Yeah,
that's part of it. So I never took a course in elocution, but I do know that once I began to sing, or once I was required to sing, I began to notice that my speech became a lot clearer, my cadencing became a lot better. It just improved so many aspects of my ability to effectively deliver a sentence.
Yeah.
That articulate as a cat. Which, I mean, I've actually met cats who were probably more articulate than I was.
Real expressive cats.
Yes, there are some expressive cats, yes, this is true. Music enables us to more clearly express ourselves. And we tend to, when I look at what music can do for you, it's like, well, music can make you more intelligent, whatever that means. The Mozart effect, the so-called Mozart effect. But what if it's not that music makes you more intelligent? Music just makes you better at being able to...
Makes you more intelligible.
Intelligible, yes. Makes you better able to communicate yourself, more intelligible in general, and also clarifies for you what you do feel, so that you're able to articulate that better.
I think they're really connected, because think of if you were to just watch someone or just listen to somebody and they didn't use any words, we just really paid attention to their gestures, to the tone, to the pitch, to how quickly or emphatically they're speaking, or even like where they're looking and where they're directing the sound. You can know what they're trying to express. It may not be a verbal knowledge, but you can really know. And if you use that in conjunction with language, it gets incredibly clear. It's like the same way maybe we have some musical forms or some instruments. It's like I'm clarifying or refining what I'm trying to express. I'm getting even more precise. I think there's something there. There's a real link between language and communication generally and music. That maybe it's just in the presentation or the means by which we do it.
We're such. You seem to be the direction you seem to be heading in is that the connection is so intimate. Music is an indispensable component of language and communication.
Or at the very least, there are the fundamentals elements of each one's are the same.
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe we have a different thing that emerges in each case that we can completely separate, but at base, we're using the same tools.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I agree with you. I think we are using the exact same tools. I think music is one side of the equation of language. Music and language at one point were the same thing, I suspect. I suspect Rousseau was right about that. Because that's what Rousseau thought. He thought that the two grew up and they just kind of split off. And I think at some level Rousseau was probably right. I mean, it's the oldest flute that's been found, like what, 30,000, 40,000 years old.
Small bone one.
Yeah, that small bone one that's found in Germany. I mean that's 40,000. I mean, dogs have been domesticated for 40,000 years. Just because we haven't discovered others that were older doesn't mean that they never existed.
That's
in fact,
true.
very likely they did. In the Mediterranean, they used reeds a lot, and of course those.
And the shells.
The shells, yeah. So certainly, I think humans have been making music for as long as we've been speaking. And the two things are just completely tied to one another. So music, in one sense, enabled us to become the thinking beings that we did become.
Yeah.
And I can kind of feel the floor rumbling as Descartes rolls in his grave. I also think, to some degree, that music, and I was going to throw this out there, it's something for you to kind of gnaw on, if you will. But I think to that degree, music arises at round about the same time that humans start to reach out for some conception, some awareness of the transcendent. This is a huge topic, and it might actually be something we can talk about at some point in another video, because it's such a vast topic, and it's something that's interested me for a very long time.
That even makes sense with what we were just talking about, because if we're thinking about we're trying to communicate, we're trying to reach out and be able to explain and talk to others, like you've got music as directed as this explanatory tool or this expressive tool. So we go out, we can send it out. How do I explain this? How do I explain that? I explain what I'm feeling, what it feels like to be alive, or anything. And it seems like it's directed in that way, just transcendently across all aspects.
I think part of what it comes is that we also imitate. Imitation is one of the root forms of learning, and in our more primate form, we used sounds and signals that we imitated from other creatures as well. So we were already locked into the importance of sound as an oral phenomena that enabled us to navigate through our environment. Right? And that gave us forms of knowledge. Now, we're talking about the transcendent. Of course, I'm going a little bit beyond that particular use and arguing that the transcendent, it strikes me as being able to abstract from the immediate here and now into idealized futures, or being able to reconceptualize past. So basically throw things into a kind of narrative structure. And we already said that with Homer, it would have been sung. Not just Homer as well, I mean the Gita would have been sung right? So it's something that's kind of cross-cultural to some degree. In fact, most creation myths are sung across the world. So there's something about sound that organizes. Writing organizes our experience in terms of space, and that's a much later concept. Pictographs organize space, but music organizes time.
Yeah. Think about we were talking about, rhythm, tone, timbre, pitch. If you get all those in alignment, you're like, if you're really doing the music right, you're expressing the correct way. All of those are attuned. It does order you, because there's the bodily aspect of it too. You've got the more abstract, more mental, more imaginative elements, which are the cadence and all that. But you actually have to perform it, and if you can align all those, it seems almost like this Greek idea. You get the integration of like thought and action.
Yes.
And that clears you up. You can think better.
Yes.
You can reach out and discover things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I was kind of actually, and it's interesting that you mentioned the Greek integration of thought and action, because I was actually kind of going towards a sort of Heideggerian approach here, right? In terms of what we know as embodied beings is time.
Yeah.
Right, and time is it's our most difficult concept in a way, but it's actually the concept in which we, as it were, touch the transcendent most intimately.
Yeah.
And since music is an organization of time, not merely space, but also time. Music's it's a very strange thing. When you think about music in terms of music, concert hall music, right? Music becomes three-dimensional. Right?
Yeah.
It is really three-dimensional when you think about it. But when you think about music alone, just no matter context, really what you're organizing is, of course, a temporal dimension.
Yeah.
And the temporal dimension is where the transcendent seems to... Our awareness of the transcendent finds its connection points through time.
Yeah. Here's maybe a little bit of a Nietzschean positing, but if you can order your time, that frees you up and enables you to do a whole lot more. If you're disordered, you're impassioned, you're suffering, and you have no organization to your time. It's incredibly hard to do anything.
Yes.
If you can order it all together and be directed towards your ends with the ordering, you can just go get it.
Yeah.
You can figure out how to do it. Like, okay, I have X amount of time to complete this task. Okay, and just fill it up the way you have to.
And that's an interesting perspective, because we're about music touching the emotions mostly, and the emotions at a certain level can be a kind of disordered thing.
Yeah.
But music enables us to order our emotions. That's something that actually Plato and Aristotle, one of the few things they actually did agree on, was that music enabled you to kind of structure and order your emotions through time. It's interesting too. I read an article not long ago. It was talking about George Gershwin, one neuroscientist who's a specialist in ADHD. He thinks Gershwin had ADHD, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that music enabled him to kind of transcend his condition. ADHD gives you what's called time blindness, where you can't really judge time very well. And so Gershwin, through music, was able to organize time and think about time in such a way where he was able to compensate, and music kind of saved him from himself and from his own condition. So I think that's, there is something about music that, in the way that it does organize time, that it actually is able to quite literally save people.
Oh, definitely. And it's like that ordering. It gives you some power when you have that type of ordering. Like James Levine, previous conductor of the Met, I think it was till 3, he didn't speak. But he'd reach up and play the piano. And once he began playing the piano, taking lessons, almost instantly he learned to speak. And all of his speech impediment problems went away. So he just had no ability to loquate before.
Wow.
And then he started playing, and it solved it.
Yeah, there's similar stories like that in Oliver Sacks' Musicophilia. Again, if you want a view from a neuroscience or a psychiatric point of view, basically he talks about how music can heal people from strokes, Parkinson's disease. Its neurological benefits seem to be endless.
Yeah.
And that's something actually the Pythagoreans talk about as well. I mean, they believe music can heal people, and there's a lot of evidence that it can literally heal you from whatever psychological disorder that you have.
I wonder what the correct way to characterize that would be. Do we say that the music is really doing the action, or that something about the music allows you to be fixed or to fix yourself?
It's a good question.
Or they just
To simply say the music does it implies a direct cause and effect relationship between music and the condition. You could say music empowers one.
Yeah, I kind of like that. That's my very Nietzschean reading of music as directed towards giving you the power.
Yeah, neat. Yeah, music empowers one towards being able to live more fully.
Yeah.
And more richly. So yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And so in that way, music kind of functioning in the sense of enabling us to reach for, even touch the transcendent.
Yeah.
It empowers us to transcend our own limited horizons.
Isn't there a Beethoven? There's a quote from somebody about reaching into the secrets of your art, and by doing so, you achieve the divine. Where men are raised by forcing their ways into the secrets of their arts. Men are raised to godhood.
I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to look for that quote now.
I know it's at the beginning of some piano guy's video.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I will be looking for the quote now. It's like I think it may be Beethoven, just off the top of my head, but it's been a long time since I've encountered it. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for
it's been a pleasure.
joining.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, and you have a great rest of your day. We'll see.
Hopefully there's something that's usable.
Yeah, hopefully there's something that's usable in our conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all again at next.